Hello, friends. Tonight's story isn't about silver spurs or standoffs at high noon. It's slower than that, heavier. It's about a world caked in dust and stitched together with hunger. A world where you wake up colder than you were when you fell asleep. And your boots don't fit right anymore because your feet are swollen from riding too long. So if you're the kind of person who's ever stared into the western sky and wondered what it really took to survive out there, go ahead and like the video if it earns it. Maybe even subscribe. And now, settle in. Loosen your shoulders. We're riding into the West, but not the one from the movies. This one. It smells like unwashed wool, rusted coffee pots, and fear. Tonight, you're not a sheriff. You're not a hero. You're just another outlaw, whose name no one remembers, and the reward on your head, let's just say, it won't buy much. You're wrapped in a blanket that smells like horse sweat and wet leather. You've been camped by a stream that froze overnight. There's frost on your saddle. The fire's burned low. One of your boots is still damp. You slept in your coat, again, because your bedroll isn't thick enough and your bones don't care how tough you look. Your fingers are numb. You flex them. Feel a twinge in your wrist from yesterday's ride. Your gang. 3 men and 1 boy who lied about his age. They're sprawled around the ashes of the fire. One of them snores like a chainsaw. Another mutters in his sleep. Something about silver coins. He's been dreaming of a better score for weeks now. You're not in the Rockies or on some cinematic mesa. You're in a ditch between 2 scrub-covered hills. You had to hide after last week's job, which wasn't a train, by the way. It was a post office. You made off with $7 and a half-open crate of envelopes you thought might contain something. They didn't. Last night, someone spilled the beans, literally. Half the pot tipped into the dirt. You still ate what was left, grits and gravel and all. This is the life. There's no bathhouse, no clean socks. Your horse is limping, and you're one bad cough away from being left behind. You're not Jesse James. You're a wanted man, but not by the people you think. No bounty hunters tracking you across the plains with righteous fury. Your name is on a single poster, tacked crooked on the wall of a saloon in a town that already forgot you passed through. And the bounty? $10. Dead or alive. By noon, the sun has burned away the frost. Your coat is too hot now, but you keep it on, because it's the only one you've got. You pull your hat low to block the glare. The brim's frayed. The sweatband inside smells like mold. Doesn't matter. You've got miles to ride, and your horse, the one you acquired outside Dodge, has a limp that's not getting better. You know it. He knows it. You pretend not to see him stumble over the loose rocks. The others don't wait. They never do. There's no honor among outlaws, no loyalty beyond usefulness. If you slow them down, they'll let you drift behind. And if you drift too far, they won't look back. You pass through a patch of sagebrush. A lizard darts away. Your canteen sloshes. Barely a mouthful left. No creeks out here. Not unless you count the muddy track a cow might drink from if it had no choice. The last town was 4 days ago. You spent your last coin on a box of cartridges that don't fit your revolver. You kept the box anyway. Might be worth something in trade. Lunch, if you can call it that, is a strip of jerky that smells faintly of mildew. It's hard as bone. You chew it until your jaw aches. And as you chew, you think about the rumors. About the man who struck it rich in Colorado. About a banker's coach coming through next month, loaded with payroll. About a saloon girl who might have smiled at you. If your coat wasn't torn. Dreams are cheap out here. Cheaper than bullets. and more dangerous, because they make you believe you're building towards something, that all this sweat and dust and pain will pay off. But deep down, you know better. You've seen what happens when a job goes wrong. And they always go wrong, because nobody plans the wind. Nobody counts on a sheriff's cousin being in town for a wedding. Nobody checks the lock twice before lighting the fuse. You carry your regrets the same way you carry your pistol. Close, heavy, and always a little too warm against your side. You ride until the sun starts to fall behind the hills. It's not beautiful. Not really. The colors are muted, the wind is dry, and the flies won't leave your face alone. Your horse stumbles again. And this time, you know, he's not going to last another day. But there's no time to stop. You're headed toward a cabin an old man told you about, half rotted, long abandoned. Said it had a roof, maybe even a stove. The gang split earlier, said they'd meet you there. But you know how that goes. If they find something better, a barn, a stream, a willing host, they won't wait. You'll arrive to cold ash and boot prints in the dirt. You shift in your saddle. Your spine aches from the jolt of every step. You're not old, not really. But this life doesn't care how many years you've walked the earth. It just keeps wearing you down until you don't get back up. And what's it all for? You haven't seen your real name written anywhere in 2 years. You don't write letters. You don't get any. If you die out here, tonight, or next week, or a year from now, no one will know. The coyotes might. They'll be the first to find you. Maybe the only. This is what being an outlaw really is. Not a jewel at high noon. Not a fortune buried under a tree. It's an endless ride. Chapped lips. Empty canteens. Guns that jam. No campfire songs. No golden sunsets. Just the creak of leather and the fear that someone behind you has more reason to shoot than you do. You reach the cabin just as the light dies. It's half collapsed. No stove, no roof, but it's shelter. And you're too tired to care. You roll off the saddle, stretch your aching legs, and sit in the dirt. Tomorrow, you'll ride again. Not because you want to, because you have to. And because stopping, truly stopping, feels more dangerous than anything else. His name was Eli. At least, that's what he called himself. He said it like it mattered, like it was enough to make him dangerous. He was 15, maybe 16. Blonde hair he tried to slick back with leftover bacon grease, and a belt buckle big enough to reflect the firelight. He showed up one evening at a desert camp near the Rio Pecos, hitching a ride with a cattleman who said, "This boy claims he's a shot." The others laughed, then stopped laughing when he hit 3 cans off a fence rail at 30 paces. So they let him stay. He didn't talk much, except about guns. His specifically, a nickel-plated Colt with a smooth ivory grip. He'd stolen it off a dead man, or so he said. Maybe his father, maybe not. Nobody asked too many questions. He kept his bedroll tight and slept with the gun across his chest. He wasn't like the other boys you saw drifting through frontier towns. He didn't ask questions, didn't beg for food, didn't smile unless he thought he could win something with it. They took him on a job a week later. Not a big one. A mail wagon, half empty. He held back, didn't fire, didn't speak. But after, he pulled the trigger on a rattlesnake near camp. Dead on the first shot. He looked around the circle and said nothing. Just holstered his gun and sat down. And that's when they started calling him the Kid. He didn't mind. He was waiting for something bigger, because he wasn't here to drift. He wanted a name, a real one. The kind that made folks lean in close when they whispered it in a saloon. But names like that come with a cost. And Eli, for all his polish and poise, hadn't paid it yet. It happened in a town called Calico Junction, a way station more than a settlement. 3 buildings, 1 well, and a depot that saw 1 train every 3 days. The gang hadn't planned anything, but they'd been drinking low-proof rye, cheap and sharp, and the kid had been staring too long at a clerk counting coins behind a depot window. Someone joked about how easy it would be. Someone else said, "Well, you got the gun, kid. You want to be a legend, right?" Eli didn't answer. He just stood up, walked toward the depot, and didn't come back for 5 minutes. When he did, he was running, hard. No one else saw what happened, only the smoke from his gun, the shock in his eyes, the way he dropped the sack of coins before he reached the horses. They rode, fast and crooked, cutting across low brush and dry riverbeds, until night fell and the silence caught up to them. No one said anything that first hour. Not until the fire was lit and Eli sat with his hands shaking, still wearing the same smirk he always did, but thinner now, stretched tight. He finally said, he wasn't supposed to be there. No one replied. He didn't mean the clerk. He meant the boy, a kid, maybe 8 or 9, who'd been behind the counter, unseen from the outside, now gone. And suddenly, Eli's shine didn't look so clean anymore. His boots were still polished, but something inside had cracked. The others noticed, but they said nothing, because this was the West, and in the West, cracks didn't matter, only whether the man kept moving. They headed north after Calico Junction. Not out of strategy, just habit. The law would come eventually. It always did. So they moved, following half-buried wagon tracks through dry scrub and sparse hills, hoping to find shelter before the weather changed. But it changed faster than expected. First came the wind, dry and biting, then frost on the saddle straps, then the snow. It wasn't the kind that blankets a town in quiet beauty. It was the kind that comes without warning, driven sideways by wind that claws at your eyes and skin. The kind that turns trails into guesswork, and guesswork into grave mistakes. Eli didn't say much. He rode near the back, his coat too thin, his gloves mismatched. His horse coughed constantly, something in its lungs, but he didn't complain, not once. He still practiced his draw every night before sleep, flicking his revolver out, spinning it fast, holstering it smooth. But slower now, more careful. The others noticed, but no one offered help. There was no extra gear, no extra warmth, and sympathy wasn't currency here. They found a cabin on the 4th day, just a frame really, no roof, 1 wall half standing, but it was shelter from the wind. They stacked brush for a fire, killed a squirrel, and boiled coffee so thin it barely darkened the pot. Eli sat by the fire with his boots off, steam rising from his socks. His toes were blue. No one mentioned it. He still had the revolver, still had the name, Kid, even if it was whispered more now than said aloud. But the cold was inside him, not just in his feet, in his eyes, in his silence. He was still holding together, but just barely. They left the ruined cabin the next morning. No one really wanted to, but the food was gone, and the cold had settled too deep. Staying meant frostbite, or wolves, or worse, boredom, the kind that makes men pick fights just to feel alive. So they rode, 4 of them now. One had vanished during the night 2 days earlier. No trace, no goodbye. Just an empty bedroll and the hoof prints heading south. They didn't talk about it. The trail was harder now. The snow crusted into ridges, cracking beneath hooves. The wind sharper, more persistent. Trees bent under the weight of it. Branches snapped like brittle bones. Eli's horse stumbled again. He didn't curse. He didn't even look down. Just kept the reins loose and his eyes fixed forward, like he was following something only he could see. By midday, they reached a creek, frozen solid, barely flowing beneath the ice. One of the older riders, Saul, hacked through with his boot heel and let the horses drink. Eli stayed back. He didn't dismount, didn't move. Finally, someone asked, "You all right, kid?" Eli nodded. Just cold. But his voice sounded thinner, brittle, not afraid, just detached. They camped again that night under a low ridge. No wood for fire, just dried horse dung and what brush they could scavenge. The smoke stung their eyes. The stars were sharp above them, too clear, too distant. Eli unrolled his blanket, lay down fully dressed, and closed his eyes. Didn't say goodnight, didn't clean his gun, didn't take off his boots, just curled into himself. He looked smaller than usual, like the weight of the revolver beside him was heavier than it had ever been. And in the silence that followed, nobody asked what he was thinking, because they already knew. At dawn, frost lined every surface. The saddle blankets were stiff. The air burned with each breath. The creek they'd crossed the day before was sealed again, this time thicker, harder. Eli didn't stir. At first, no one noticed. Men in the west were slow to wake, slower still in the cold. But after the fire was coaxed into life and the coffee started to hiss over the embers, someone called out, "Kid?" No answer. His blanket hadn't moved. They approached carefully, like you would a sleeping animal. Not out of fear exactly, but something quieter, something like dread. He lay curled on his side, hat still on, hands tucked into his coat, eyes closed. Not a mark on him. No blood, no wound, just stillness. Saul knelt beside him, laid a gloved hand on Eli's back, then shook his head. "He's gone." The others didn't react. Not really. They stood, breathed, stared at the fire. And in that moment, it wasn't grief they felt. It was recognition. The same thing had happened before. Not often, but enough. Sometimes a man just doesn't make it through the night. Not because he was shot, not because of sickness, just because he got too cold, too tired, too far from anything that mattered. They didn't bury him. Ground was frozen, and there was no one to inform. Instead, they took his revolver, it was good steel after all, and covered his body with his own blanket, weighted it with stones, not out of malice, out of custom, out of necessity. They rode on before the sun had fully cleared the ridge, and by noon they were laughing again. Not about Eli, about something else. Something they'd forget just as easily. Because in the Wild West, everyone's name fades. Some just faster than others. They left the boy in silence. The trail led them eastward across a dry basin crusted with frost. No one spoke his name. Not because they'd forgotten, but because names had weight. And out here, no one wanted to carry more than they had to. The revolver he left behind changed hands twice by sundown. It jammed once. Saul fixed it, said nothing. By nightfall, it sat on a saddlebag next to a tin of beans, as ordinary as a shovel or a boot. And that was the truth of it. In the West, death wasn't rare. It wasn't dramatic. It was just part of the ride. You didn't build monuments. You didn't write letters home. You didn't weep by the fire. You kept moving because the land didn't care if you stopped. The sky didn't remember your face. And the trail always stretched further than you thought it would. Somewhere, in a ledger or a wanted poster, the name Eli might still linger. A shaky signature, a partial description. Maybe just young, quiet, good shot. But out here, no one would find his grave. No one would mark the day. He'd come west chasing legend, but legend never came back for him. And the West, it never owed you anything. The men he rode with wouldn't talk about Eli. Not really. Not around the fire. Not in the saddle. Not even in saloons, months later, when whiskey loosened their tongues and the stories started flowing. They might mention a kid we used to know, or say, there was a boy rode with us a while. But they wouldn't tell the truth of it, that he was just a boy who wanted to matter, who thought a fast draw and a silver belt buckle were enough to make a name. They wouldn't say that he died with his boots on, because that didn't mean anything out here. Most men did. They wouldn't mention the sound he made in his sleep, a soft wheeze, almost like a song, or the way he flinched every time someone raised a voice, even in laughter. They wouldn't talk about the look in his eyes after that job in Calico Junction, that haunted, hollow stare, because to say those things out loud would make it real, would make it stick, and the West had no room for mourning, only forward motion, only survival. So they kept his name to themselves, buried it with him beneath that thin blanket and the river stones, and rode on. In the end, Eli didn't become a legend. He became a silence, the kind that settles between two sentences around the fire, the kind that passes like a shadow over a trail you've ridden too many times. He never made the papers. There were no songs about him, no dime novels, no Last Stand, just a body under a blanket in a season that came too early. And somewhere out there, on a forgotten ridge with no name, the wind still moves the dirt. Maybe one day someone will stumble across his bones. Maybe not. It doesn't matter, because the story of Eli, the boy who thought being an outlaw meant freedom, is one that happened over and over in the Old West. Boys with big dreams, quick hands, and no one to bury them. They came west looking for something. Gold, glory, a clean slate. Most of them found cold, hunger, silence, and a name no one remembered. So if you ever think about riding out into the dust with a pistol on your hip and the wind in your face, remember Eli. And know this, the West didn't hate him. It just didn't care. When people imagine justice in the Wild West, they picture a sheriff with a tin star and a steady hand, a man of honor patrolling dusty streets with his coat flapping behind him. But the truth, the law was late, always. By the time a posse arrived, the outlaw was gone. By the time a marshal heard your name, someone else had already been shot. There were towns, entire towns, where the sheriff lived 20 miles away, where the nearest jail had no roof, where court was held on a porch beside a saloon, with chickens clucking underfoot, and where law wasn't about right or wrong. It was about who had time, who had friends, who had bullets. If you were robbed in the hills, you didn't go to the law. You went to your neighbor, or your cousin, or the man who owed you a favor from the war. Justice was improvised, and more often than not, it never came. When it did, it wasn't clean, it wasn't fair, and it rarely wore a badge. Imagine a jail in the 1870s. Not the iron-barred, brick-built fortress you might picture from the movies. Just a shack. A wooden room, 12 feet by 8. One barred window, if you were lucky. No cot, no chamber pot. The floor was dirt. The roof leaked. The lock, a rusty latch that could be pried open with a spoon. Most prisoners weren't dangerous, just drunk. Thrown in overnight for disorderly conduct, horse thievery, or shouting scripture at passers-by after too much rye. But when someone serious came along, a killer or an armed thief, the jail didn't hold, because it wasn't meant to. There were jailbreaks every week, not dramatic escapes, just someone kicking the wall hard enough to knock a plank loose. Sometimes the sheriff didn't bother locking up at all. He'd take your gun, make you sleep in the corner, and hope you were sober enough to leave quietly in the morning. And if you didn't, well, you might get shot, or chased out of town, or just forgotten, because keeping prisoners was expensive and slow. And in the West, nobody liked slow. Not every lawman was crooked, but none of them were clean. Take the town marshal, not elected, not salaried, often just the man who looked most comfortable with a revolver and didn't flinch when blood hit the ground. He wasn't always the best man, sometimes not even a good one, but he was useful. And in towns trying to stay afloat on whiskey and freight, usefulness mattered more than virtue. The marshal wore a badge, yes, a star, usually pinned over a coat he hadn't washed in weeks. He carried a shotgun or a revolver, sometimes both, and he made his rounds at dusk and dawn, boots thudding on boardwalks, always watching. But he didn't patrol like in the stories. He negotiated. If two ranch hands came to blows over poker, he'd separate them, maybe fire a round into the floorboards to get their attention. If a drifter got too loud in church, he'd be escorted out with a shoulder squeeze, not a speech, because the marshal knew something most folks didn't want to admit. If he tried to enforce every law by the book, he wouldn't last a week. He had to choose which rules mattered, and which ones could be bent. He let the saloons serve after midnight, so long as the barman kept the windows closed. He let brothels operate as long as they paid donations to the town. And if a man rode into town with a wanted poster bearing his face, the marshal would watch him for a while, weigh his options. Sometimes he'd invite him to leave quietly. Other times he wouldn't, because a bounty was money, and lawmen in the West made very little. There were marshals who killed for reward money, who turned in corpses, not captives, who looked the other way when their friends rode a little too fast past the "no guns in town" sign. And if the townspeople objected, they were reminded the marshal was all that stood between them and chaos. And in most cases, they agreed, because a crooked marshal was still better than none at all. Sometimes there was no marshal. Sometimes there was a marshal, and the town didn't trust him. And that's when the real fear began, because justice didn't vanish without a badge. It simply changed shape. It became a mob. They didn't call themselves that, of course. They used softer words like committee or posse or citizen circle. They wore bandanas over their faces, or they didn't. They moved at night. They didn't ask permission. They found the man, accused, suspected, sometimes guilty, sometimes not, and they acted. The lynchings didn't happen in back alleys. They happened right in the middle of town, outside the saloon, beside the jail, from the rafters of the grain store or the arm of a weathered oak tree. And there wasn't always outrage. There wasn't always resistance. Because in a land where the law was distant, slow, or corrupt, the rope was faster. It didn't ask questions. It didn't leave paperwork. And in the morning, most townspeople walked past the hanging body without looking up. Not because they didn't care, because they couldn't care, not openly. And besides, more often than not, the man strung up wasn't a hero. Maybe he'd stolen horses. Maybe he'd shot a man over a spilled drink. Maybe he was simply new in town. Wrong accent, wrong skin, wrong friends. It didn't take much. And when it was over, someone, maybe the preacher, maybe the mayor, would say, he brought it on himself. And the town would go quiet for a few days, until it didn't. And the gallows wood, or the tree limb, or the length of rope, waited, not as a symbol of justice, but as a memory, a warning. That law in the West wasn't something written. It was something you survived. In the frontier towns that did hold trials, justice looked nothing like the courtrooms you see in the movies. There were no polished benches, no rows of jurors in suits, no impassioned closing arguments echoing through marble halls. The courtroom might be a saloon cleared for the day, or the back of a general store where barrels of molasses shared space with murder charges. The judge, sometimes he was a traveling circuit man, educated, cautious, doing his best. Other times, he was the wealthiest landowner around, self-appointed, impatient, and ready to clear the docket by sundown. Juries were drawn from whoever could be spared from their farms or businesses that week. 12 men, if they were lucky. 6, if they weren't. And sometimes none at all. Because trials in the West weren't about justice. They were about resolution. A stolen horse needed a quick answer. A killing in a saloon. Just get someone blamed, buried, and out of the way. The towns didn't have the luxury of waiting, nor the resources to house prisoners for weeks on end. And the law books, most were years out of date. Many were never opened. Verdicts were often decided before the trial began, shaped by gossip, by fear, or by the defendant's last name. And punishment, it was swift. A fine if you were lucky. A branding in rare cases. More often, a rope, or a bullet behind the jail. And the crowd would disperse like it was Sunday market day, back to chopping wood, sewing clothes, hauling water. Because that was the rhythm of the West. Violence, judgment, then chores. Even those who knew the system was flawed kept quiet. Because in the wilderness, justice wasn't about fairness. It was about keeping things moving, keeping order just steady enough that the train could come through, that the preacher could give his sermon, that the mail could be delivered, and the children sent to sleep without crying. And for that, some towns were willing to hang the wrong man, just to keep the peace. When the courts failed, and they often did, justice was outsourced to bounty hunters, to freelancers, to men who didn't care about truth, only proof. Proof that you were the man on the poster. Proof that the bullet in your chest matched the name scratched onto a slip of paper behind the sheriff's desk. The bounty system was simple on paper. A crime was committed. A warrant was written. A reward posted. Wanted, dead or alive. Sometimes it was $50. Sometimes $200. Enough to make a poor man take risks. Enough to make a desperate one start hunting strangers who looked familiar. It was an industry built on faces, bad sketches, faded memories, descriptions that said things like tallish, brown coat, missing tooth, mean eyes. That's all it took. And once the poster was nailed to the wall, you were prey. even if you weren't the man they wanted, especially then, because bringing in the right man earned you money, but bringing in someone got the job done. The bounty hunter didn't ask questions. He asked for payment. If he found you alive, you were lucky. If he found you asleep, or wounded, or already half frozen in a ditch, he made it look clean. Put one round through the chest. Dragged you into town behind a tired horse, collected. And the townsfolk? They didn't look too close. Because justice, in their eyes, had already been served. It had a name, a poster, and a price tag. Whether the man under the canvas tarp was guilty or not, that was beside the point. The bounty had been paid, and that was enough. In the absence of real institutions, the West leaned on something else entirely. Reputation. If you were feared, you were obeyed. Not because people thought you were right, but because they hoped you wouldn't notice them. A town might follow its marshal, not because of the badge, but because he once killed 3 men in a bar fight and never blinked. A saloon might stay quiet, not because the owner was respected, but because he kept a shotgun behind the bar and had nothing left to lose. Fear became its own kind of justice, a deterrent, an invisible gallows. Some men cultivated it. They wore black, spoke rarely, let rumors do the work. Others had it forced upon them. Men who fought back once and now lived with eyes on their backs forever. In this landscape, justice was not a courtroom ideal. It was a performance. You had to look like you wouldn't hesitate. You had to sound like you'd shoot first. That's what kept you safe. A trembling shopkeeper might get robbed. A quiet traveler might get harassed. But a man with a reputation? He could ride through town, silent, and clear a path like a knife through cloth. And so the West filled itself with performances. Men pretending to be colder than they were. Women hiding knives in their sleeves. Children learning early when to speak and when to vanish. Because in a world with no central order, no lasting justice, all that was left was fear. And fear worked until someone feared you just enough to act. And then your name was on a poster too. Another notch in the long, splintered ledger of justice. In the stories, justice rides in at the last minute. A stranger with clear eyes and steady hands. A six-shooter slung low. A code of honor pressed into every crease of his coat. He cleans up the town, defeats the villain, tips his hat, and rides into the sunset. But in the real West, justice didn't wear a white hat. It wore dust. It wore uncertainty. Sometimes it wore the face of the man who shot your brother, or the neighbor who stole your cattle and then joined the sheriff's posse to prove his loyalty. It was messy, compromised, always delayed. There were no final showdowns, only confusion, only fear. Only the hope that maybe, just maybe, today wouldn't be the day your name got added to the wrong list. And maybe that's what defined the West more than anything else. Not lawlessness, but improvised law. Not fairness, but survival. Justice was a shifting thing like dust on a trail, impossible to hold, easy to choke on. And those who tried to carry it, they usually ended up buried beside the men they brought in. Unmarked graves, shallow stories, forgotten names. So if you ever find yourself imagining a clean kind of justice, sharp, shining, righteous, remember this. Out here, justice came late, and it came hungry, and it rarely asked who was right, only who was left. The saloon was more than a watering hole. It was a nerve center, a trading post for secrets, lies, and the slow unwinding of weary men. When you stepped through its swinging doors, you stepped into something carefully orchestrated, even if it smelled like old tobacco and spilled whiskey. The barkeep ran it all. He wasn't just pouring drinks, he was managing the room, keeping drunk miners from starting fights, smoothing over a gambler's latest debt, giving the sheriff a nod if someone suspicious rode into town. He saw everyone, and he remembered everything. Men talked when they were tired, when they were drunk, when they thought the piano music would cover their voices. They mentioned upcoming jobs, shared names they shouldn't have, slipped details they wouldn't even remember by morning. But the barkeep remembered. He had to, because knowledge was power. And in the West, power didn't always ride a horse or carry a gun. Sometimes it stood behind a bar, wiping glasses with a threadbare rag, listening and waiting for the right time to use it. She went by Clara, or sometimes May. Names weren't fixed in the West, especially for women who lived by the hour, the smile, and the tilt of a corset. Clara didn't ride. She didn't shoot. She didn't steal cattle or rob stagecoaches. She stayed, and in a town where everything else moved, where men vanished between dawn and dusk, staying was power. She knew who drank too much, who lied about their wealth, who left their wedding ring in their coat pocket. She also knew who to trust, not because she asked questions, but because no one thought to hide things from her. They spoke in front of her like she wasn't there, but she was always there. And if something needed to happen, a word in the right ear, a letter slipped to the right train conductor, Clara could make it happen. She didn't have a badge. She had perfume, powder, patience. And in the long run, that lasted longer than bullets. While outlaws were chasing stagecoaches and marshals were chasing outlaws, the merchant was chasing a ledger. Every town had one. A man with wire-rimmed glasses, a creased shirt, and ink stains on his fingers. He sold nails, beans, flour, candles. Nothing glamorous, but everything necessary. And he extended credit, which meant he held power. If you owed him, he could ruin you. He knew whose wives came in for sugar and left with bruises on their wrists. He knew which men sold bullets one week and bought coffins the next. He didn't enforce justice. He was justice in a way. Because when the sheriff was drunk, or the preacher too soft, the storekeeper remembered your debts. And debts in the West were sacred. Miss a payment, and you might not eat through winter. Make good on a promise, and he might keep you alive. The gunman got the glory, but the merchant kept the town standing. And if you crossed him, no one would stop him from cutting you off, because everyone needed him. And in the West, need mattered more than fear. The banker arrived late in most towns, long after the first cabins were built, long after the first bullet holes scarred the saloon door. But when he arrived, things began to change. He didn't carry a gun. He carried contracts. He wore clean shirts, even in the dust, kept his mustache neat, built a house with glass windows, which meant he was either brave or untouchable. His power wasn't in force, it was in paper. He loaned to cattlemen, to railroad men, even to the sheriff when badge money ran thin. And with every loan came a hold, on land, on livestock, on futures. He was polite, professional, courteous to the preacher's wife and the widow, who couldn't quite make her payments. But he remembered every name, every cent, and if you defaulted, you didn't get shot. You got erased, land taken, reputation stained, opportunities gone. He didn't shout, he didn't threaten. He didn't need to, because in a land built on borrowed time and borrowed tools, the man who owned the paper owned everything, even the men with the guns. At first glance, the schoolteacher seemed the least powerful of all. She wore plain dresses, taught children to read and write, and kept order with a ruler, not a pistol. But her influence was quiet, woven into the future. The children she taught would grow into the townspeople, the voters, the landowners. And in teaching them, she shaped the town's soul. She was the keeper of stories and laws, the bearer of knowledge no bullet could erase. Parents came to her with worries, whispered complaints about husbands and neighbors, and though she spoke softly, her words carried weight. The teacher's respect could open doors. Her disapproval could close them forever. She lived in the shadows of saloons and shootouts, but her power was enduring. Because power in the West was not always loud. Sometimes it was quiet. Sometimes it was the ink on a lesson plan. And sometimes that was enough. Widows held a strange power in the West. Few men survived long enough to build lasting legacies, and even fewer women were granted the right to inherit. But those who did, the widows, became quiet matriarchs. They owned land, they managed ranches, they kept accounts, and they commanded respect, sometimes grudging, sometimes genuine, from hired hands, neighbors, and even the local law. Their authority wasn't given lightly. It was earned through grit and endurance. They knew how to negotiate with cattle buyers, how to deal with rustlers, how to keep the peace when tempers flared. And in their hands, the West changed slowly, because where men came and went, widows stayed, stable, steadfast, a backbone no revolver could replace. In the vast, sprawling landscape of the Old West, where the horizon stretched endless and the wind seemed to carry secrets as old as the earth itself, the preacher stood apart. He was a man without a gun, a man whose power was not measured in bullets or brawn, but in words. The kind spoken softly in wooden churches filled with rough-hewn pews, or under the open sky where dust motes danced like tiny spirits. His voice was steady, sometimes gentle, sometimes firm, echoing through the small settlements where life was often fragile and fleeting. Every Sunday, he called the weary, the hopeful, the desperate to gather beneath the cross. There, in that humble space, he offered more than sermons. He offered order, a vision of justice not carried by rifles, but by conscience. The preacher's authority was subtle yet profound. He baptized children into a faith that promised more than the endless cycle of violence. He married young couples, weaving their lives together in vows that echoed beyond the lawless streets. He buried the dead, friends, foes, and strangers alike, with prayers whispered over bare graves. And in doing so, he held the community together. His approval was sought quietly in the shadows. A nod from him could calm a brewing feud. His disapproval was a weight heavier than any fist, for even the roughest men feared the preacher's quiet judgment. His power wasn't absolute. He could not stop a gunfight, nor could he command the town marshal. But he was a moral compass, a reminder of something larger than survival. He spoke of forgiveness, of mercy, of grace, ideals that softened the harshness of frontier life. And when the nights were cold and long, his words lingered in the air like a balm. Because in a land ruled by uncertainty and raw force, the preacher's authority was a quiet but steady hand, guiding those who dared to listen toward hope and peace. Beyond the swinging doors of saloons, beyond the bright eyes of the saloon girls and the steady hands of the widows, there existed another world, one filled with the quiet labor of women whose names were rarely spoken aloud, yet whose influence seeped deep into the fabric of frontier life. These were the cooks who stirred endless pots over smoky fires, the seamstresses who mended torn shirts and patched weather-worn coats, the laundresses who scrubbed away the grime of dusty trails from the collars and cuffs of every man in town. Their days were long, their work uncelebrated. They rose early to stoke the fires, to bake bread before dawn, to prepare simple meals that would nourish weary hands and worn souls. Their hands were roughened by toil, but they were gentle with the children who clamoured at their knees. Though their roles were often seen as domestic and invisible, they were anything but powerless. These women were keepers of stories, the silent witnesses to the whispered confessions, the secret deals, the unguarded moments behind closed doors. Men shared fears and hopes with these women, trusting them with truths they dared not voice elsewhere. A knowing glance, a soft word, a careful smile. These small gestures could soothe tempers, calm jealousies, and mend fractured friendships. In many ways, these women held the town together. Their presence was a thread woven through every household, every gathering, every act of survival. Without their steady hands and quiet strength, the wild chaos of frontier life would have unraveled into disorder. Their power was subtle, often unacknowledged, but enduring. And though history may have overlooked them, these women shaped the West. One stitch, one meal, one whispered secret at a time. In the harsh expanse of the West, power wasn't always drawn from a holstered revolver or carved from a gunfighter's quick draw. It was found in the quiet corners, in the stories told beneath the flickering light of oil lamps, in the debts owed and favors granted in hushed tones. Power came from the letters sent across dusty trails to distant cities, letters that held promises of credit, alliances, and hope. It came from the soft hand on a shoulder, the subtle nod that opened doors, the careful negotiation whispered behind closed doors. The true strength of the West often lived in the unseen, those who held influence without ever firing a shot, the merchants who extended credit and thereby held the town's future in their ink-stained hands, the widows who managed ranches and estates with a steady eye and unwavering will, the teachers who shaped young minds, planting seeds of knowledge that would grow long after gunfire ceased, the preachers who wielded words like swords and shields, carving out morality in a land often bereft of it, and the women behind the scenes, whose work and wisdom kept the fragile fabric of community from unraveling. They were the unsung architects of survival. Their power was patience, persistence, and presence. And sometimes, the sharpest weapon in the West was not a bullet. It was a whisper, a smile, a promise kept. Now, as the dust settles on these stories of outlaw trails and whispered powers, remember, the West was never just about gunfights or lawmen. It was a place of quiet endurance, where survival wasn't about glory, but about small, steady acts of strength. The preacher's quiet words, the widow's firm hand, the barkeep's knowing glance, the outlaw's weary ride through cold and hunger. These are the true tales, the ones written not in the pages of legend, but in the hearts of those who lived them. So as you drift toward rest tonight, let the wide, open sky remind you of their enduring spirit, of the silence between gunshots, and the power of a whispered story. Good night.